Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's very special guest is from the world of basketball. He has featured works on such sites and platforms as Raptors Republic, The Score, The Defeated. He's a big fan of Never Walking Alone. He has also worked with Yahoo Sports Canada doing Raptors Over Everything, the podcast that covers Toronto in the NBA, and currently hosts the Raptors show for Sportsnet covering the Toronto Raptors. Please give it up for Will Liu. Will, thanks for joining me on today's show, man. I'm super excited to chat basketball with you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And yeah, it was a great intro. It's really nice to hear that back. It's there's a lot of years there.
As mentioned just before we started recording, I still remember the days that my brother and dad and I would gather around the computer and wait for the quick thoughts slander recap of the 22-60 2010-11 Raptors and all the treachery that this team went through before Masai came and saved it with his graceful powers. How do you reflect back on those days now that the expectation for the Raptors is to be one of the premier franchises in the NBA? Doesn't that just seem so weird?
Yes, it does. I think what makes you appreciate it more is like having been a fan for like close to 20 years now. It's you start to see like new generations start to come in, and sometimes you look at like the newer fans who came, let's say 2014 when the We the North era started. I mean, they are used to seeing their team in the playoff every single year. You're used to seeing an all-star from the team make it every single year. You're used to seeing, 50 plus wins a lot of these times. And then there's that generation. Then you got the most recent generation, which is, oh, the Raptors won the championship. So a lot of people really hopped on then. And the expectations that those people have are even higher. It's like not just, making an all-star or making the playoffs. It's like competing for champions every single year. And when you compare that to like the older generations who saw pretty much anything before 2013, um, it's like we're from two different families, really. But I think it's good. I think the fact that the Raptors have actually pulled themselves out of basically becoming. I mean, they were basically like the Sacramento Kings, So to get out of that to the premium position they are today is awesome to see.
I'm sure that hearing some of the names of the obscure Raptors and the 14th and 15th men that used to occupy the bench may be something close to that of post-traumatic stress disorder. But who are some of the most obscure Raptors that you remember from those days that you probably haven't heard of in a long time?
Yeah, I really liked Rasho Nesterovic. I thought his game was really nice. Fit the Raptors quite well. It's a good trade for the Raptors at that time. The Raptors had some pretty good role players around that time. It felt like when Brian Colangelo came in, he signed every single European player possible. So he brought Anthony Parker over. He brought, Jorge Garbajosa, Jose Calderon, and a lot of these really worked out. And it gave the team this sort of like European flavor, which is sort of like I guess one way they kind of sold it. But also, at that time, the modern NBA game hadn't really fully fleshed out yet. So to bring in a lot of guys who are really good at 3-point shooting, who had some skill sets to sort of play what I think the game is eventually moved towards was kind of interesting. I'm not trying to say Brian Colangelo was ahead of his time, but he did bring in players who played a European style of basketball, which is now the style of basketball today. So, and then you moved on to some of the darker years where he was getting guys like, Leandro Barbosa, because his key free agent signing of Hedo Turkoglu flamed out in half a season. So he went to trade for Barbosa, who then the Raptors made like basically their number one option for a while, which was never really quite his role. And the whole idea was to sort of inflate his trade value. And then ultimately, I believe he was traded for a top 55 protected pick, or maybe it was just a 55th pick. But in any case, yeah, that's very depressing when you think about all of that. But luckily, we're in a much better place, and it's really coincided with the time where I think a lot of people have really wanted to join the coverage of the Raptors, and it's a perfect confluence. Like the fact that the team is good really allows for a lot of opportunities everywhere else.
Especially when you think about some of the people who are covering the Raptors now and the positive energy that surrounds the franchise. Back in the day, we're talking about writing in a blogger style versus generic dry recaps. You were having to sit there and go through the ringer recapping games in as funny and lighthearted a manner as possible when the Raptors were losing by 40 to the Nuggets, the infamous game that caused Sam Mitchell to get fired, or them losing by 17 on the road in Minnesota in 2010-11, one of the only 3 times they had lost to the Timberwolves since I think it was 2000, since the turn of the century or something like that. Now, when you look at the style of your work, how do you compare it in terms of what you were looking to fine tune as the Raptors started to get good? Because of course it's very easy to pour it on and to not be critical, but how did you maybe adjust your work to ensure that you were still producing at a high quality versus making sure that we're still authentic to your own style?
Yeah, I don't think I'd ever really worried too much about the authenticity of the style. I think, you know, that comes from being just an unabashed fan of the team. And I understand that, you know, probably more in hockey, there's that rule of don't cheer in the press box. I've been in the Raptors press box like for 3 seasons now, and there's quite a bit of cheering, not just from me, but from everyone else. And no, I think that that's okay because you can still be impartial to what you're saying. And I think especially now on social media, like if you are saying something, if you are presenting something, if you're publishing something, people will probably hold you accountable to it. And whether that's a bad prediction or whether that's an uninformed take or whether that's just straight up an incorrect or infactual take, people will let you know. And I think that's the part where it kind of naturally safeguards you. But I think for me, speaking to my work and just, it's always been something where I came into it as an outsider. I didn't go into any journalism program. I kind of learned on the job, which is a very standard, I think, path for a lot of people who start the game as bloggers. And you know, in doing so, I think I've built an audience that was very always accustomed to me covering it from that fan's perspective. And that doesn't mean fans can't be informed. Fans are very informed. And I think that's where, you know, some media who choose not to use the fans' perspective might potentially even look down on the fans, because I think fans are, especially nowadays, they're inundated with so much great coverage and so much information and data that there's no reason for any fan to be uninformed. They could just choose to actually look out for what's there. And yeah, and I think, you know, and speaking back to my work, is just that's what people have always expected from me, and know me for. So I didn't really ever see a reason to change it. Now I think the bigger part is just maturing as a person, because when I entered the business, I was like probably 22, 23 years old. And now as I approach my 30s, it's like, well, you know, hopefully you do mature as a person, and that comes with, you know, being able to be more sympathetic and putting things into more perspective, which I think ultimately is going to help improve the work. But I think it's a life maturation more than it's a concerted like change in how I want to cover the team.
What were you doing before you started blogging with Raptors Republic?
Yeah, a whole lot of nothing. So I was in university, and I think for a lot of kids in university, you get into this position where you're there, and then you have to make these key life decisions, and you realize that you don't really know what you're actually deciding on, and ultimately you have a really miserable time because you have a lot of expectations, but you're also not doing a lot. And that was where I was at. And you know, I kind of got into a dark place, and I thought, well, the way to get out of it is to try to do something productive, and the way to feel happier is to do something that I really like. And those two kind of things brought me to basketball media, which I was consuming in abundance at that time, whether that was at Raptors Republic, whether that was listening to podcasts at that time like the Basketball Jones. And I really wanted to do that myself. And if I was going to indulge in that habit and indulge in that hobby, I wanted to turn that into something really productive. And so I essentially, you know, had all the tools. It basically just needed internet, and starting a podcast was a lot harder at that time, but you know, starting a blog was very easy. And just basically wanted to get into it and do something productive with my time. And I think luckily I was able to find a couple of opportunities around me that allowed me to continue growing as someone who was going to eventually work in media. But most importantly, at that time, when I was like probably 20, 21 years old, like that was just a self-preservation, like just finding something to sort of get myself on track.
Before I touch more on what that transformation was like, where were you studying and what program were you in?
So I was in McMaster. My original plan was to, you know, be the first Asian doctor. No, I'm kidding. That's a joke. there's too many of us already. But in any case, that was my original plan. It was not a lot of imagination that really went into it. I don't think I really had the commitment or was good enough of a student to fully reach that level. I switched over to a chemistry program, which was mostly because I was good at chemistry in the first year. Then I realized I hated being in a lab. It was just genuinely the most awful experience you could really imagine. Everything's very tense all the time, and you'd make one error, then 4 months of work really go down the drain. It's still a little triggering for me right now. Plus, on top of the fact that organic chemistry is like the hardest course ever imaginable. And then so I switched from there to economics just because that was a very open program. You could transfer a lot of credits over to it. And but ultimately, like I was just kind of lost. Like I mentioned, like I really didn't know what I was doing. And it was a hard time in life for me just to think about my future and sort of what I was doing with my time. So at that time, my program was me sitting in the back of the classroom with my laptop watching the Raptors game or any other basketball game that was on that night. So I majored in procrastinating.
I think that you graduated with high distinction and were on the dean's list of that program.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, listen, this is the best case scenario for a guy who did what I did.
Absolutely. And, it's timely with Asian Heritage Month and how we think about, oftentimes you're mentioning before, am I Portuguese Brazilian? I wouldn't say that I necessarily have as many cultural expectations passed from my parents as they did from theirs, but there's the good and the bad of cultural expectations, and also just what our culture means to us, being children of immigrants or immigrants, and how that can help us or hurt us depending on what environment you're raised in. And you talk about, joking about, being the first Asian doctor, and being a doctor comes with a lot of prestige, responsibility, and money. But at the same time, like you said, not everyone's cut out for it. And I think that it's difficult for some people to grapple with. And some other guests I've interviewed who have been in similar scenarios where their parents say you're a doctor or a lawyer or something that's prestigious, or you're a failure. And I think that it's difficult to go through that if you don't really have help or other people there to support you. And so when you made that transition, what was the most difficult part, but what helped you keep going forward with wanting to do blogging for Raptors basketball and just the NBA in general?
I mean, I think the most difficult part was accepting for myself that this is something that I wanted, and that's something that I could give myself permission to chase. I thought the odds were very long, and it didn't really feel like that lucrative of a business to go into. Quite frankly, having been in it for a long time, it's not. I think that's the majority of the experiences for most people that I've worked with. However, I think for me at that time was just like accepting that this is what I wanted to do. I think sometimes it's really hard to sort of embrace that part about yourself, and you got to give yourself permission. I think when you're younger, it's harder. When you're older, you're probably more experienced and know that things are going to be okay as long as you really put your heart into it. And I think that was the hardest part. I mean, even with my parents, I mean, there's two approaches you could take. You could really like face it head on and really own it and take that decision, or you could just completely hide it and just tell them that, like, hey, don't worry, life is going to be whatever, it's going to be fine. But I mean, like, I also don't want to really even perpetuate some of these stereotypes about like Asian parenting. I mean, look, a lot of them are very true, and it's honestly very funny to joke about. But I think in the case of my parents, like, they were actually very open with everything. I think the idea was, whatever choices I make in life, my dad's advice was, whatever choice I make in life is just like, you got to live with them. So just, obviously try to make the right choice, but, ultimately try to stick it through and make the best of every situation. And yeah, even when I went into this business, it was like, they were like, okay, that's cool. We probably would like you to get an MBA or something, but, I guess the MBA is okay too.
Well, the NBA, I think, is not that bad of an option considering the work that you've been able to do, the places you've been able to go, and the things you've been able to see. When you think about the 2019 championship run alone, I think that's something that us Raptors fans who've been following the team for a long time, especially through the many miserable years post Chris Bosh and pre Masai, is something we dreamed of once in a lifetime. And it happened so suddenly. And sometimes it doesn't even seem real.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I always like to joke that, I owe like half my career to Masai. Like if the team is like as bad as it was before, then there wouldn't even be jobs, period. Right. Let alone all this content that has sort of like evolved. And you look at like, I mean, wow, we as Raptor fans right now, you're like spoiled for choice when it comes to coverage across all sorts of different platforms, across like, like even for like something that I do, like for example, every day I do the Raptor show and it's on YouTube, it's on TV, it's a podcast, it's on the radio. I write for one of the biggest publications, sports publications in Canada. It's like, and that's just me. Like there's tons of people who are covering this team now in all sorts of different ways. And if you wanted to, you could literally read or listen and watch Raptors content from night from morning to night, which back then, trust me, like part of the reason I even had this idea that to even do this as a job was because of the fact that I was like, there's just no one else doing it. So maybe someone should do it, and yeah, I was able to hit the market at a good time, and yeah, it really worked out.
You and Alex have done a great job with the Raptors show. And even just before that, I know that I've heard mention of it from friends and colleagues about how great it is to watch and listen to on Sportsnet. But the previous days, as we mentioned before, of Raptors Republic or long before the big jobs was just the genuine, authentic love for the Raptors and the personalities that came through on Twitter or in your writing were just something that it was just a lot of fun to follow. What has been your relationship, or what has your relationship been with Alex over these last few years of working with the Raptors, working together, and just being able to follow both your passions?
Yeah, it's been really awesome because I don't think I could do half of what I really have done, especially nowadays when I'm working day to day with him. But even before that, like, for me, before I started working in the media industry, in sports media, like I was a big fan of all sorts of coverage, and I would always like, I would spend hours reading and listening to things. And Alex always really stood out to me as like someone who was doing things in his own way, in a way that was innovative, was so good at storytelling. He still is, and that's why he's got multiple best-selling books now and all the success that he's had. But at that time, it was just so interesting to see the way he was covering sports. And he was in New York, but I had already been following his work for a year at that point, and then he came back to Toronto, and I met him there. And I think it was nice too because for his perspective, like he's always put a lot of emphasis in mentoring up and coming people in the media, and it's something that for as long as I've known him, he's done that. He's always got a couple people under his wing at all times, and I know that early on he was also starting to follow my stuff, even though I wasn't even doing really that much. But he was following along just because he wanted to support and he saw something in me as well. And so, I was a fan of Alex, and now, we're just really good friends and we're able to collaborate on a lot of these things. I think, speaking to us on a personal level, we are good friends. We are aligned in most of the things. We have a lot of shared experiences, even though we didn't know each other until adulthood. But I think that really works. And I think that we've also had the fortune of being able to have a lot of opportunities where we've been given reps to develop our style, our chemistry, our dialogue. And I think that really translated well into bigger platforms like Yahoo and eventually to now at Sportsnet.
Now transitioning a little bit to sports fandom. I know that you guys don't just always talk about basketball, you talk about soccer and you talk about other sports. Has soccer been something in particular that you followed as well for as long a time as basketball, or did it come later or before?
Soccer is my first love. My dad played soccer for as long as I've really known him. That was the first sport he introduced me to, and I mean, never played soccer at a very distinguished level in any case, but it's always been the sport that I've loved the most. It's how I entered into sports, really. It's just like loving soccer. And like once I got to Canada and basketball was like a thing that people played here, and that's where that kind of interest came from. But yeah, soccer's my favorite sport. I don't know if people know this, but I know people just assume that I love basketball, which I really truly do. But no, I mean, there's a reason why soccer is the global game. Like Yeah.
What are some of your favorite first memories of soccer when you were a kid, whether it be watching or playing?
I think, my favorite moments were always just like, my dad would drive to play in like a men's league in Scarborough. We lived in Etobicoke at that time, so it would be like a 30-40 minute drive each week, and he would go play, and just watching him play and always cheering him on, and you know playing on the sidelines with the other kids. There's a lot of fathers there with their kids and everything like that. That was really cool. To be honest, like, he wasn't like a big like sports fan. Like, he wasn't like, well, where this house was like a Liverpool house or anything like that. I mean, we didn't really have any like club fandom at the house. But for me, around the time when I started watching sports more intently, sort of across all sports, like, that was the time where Liverpool made that miracle in Istanbul, against AC Milan, coming back from 3-0 at halftime, to win the European Championship. And it was like, okay, I'm gonna pick this team to continue supporting. Then of course it kind of went downhill for a long time after that point. I'm not gonna lie to you. But now Liverpool is back on top, and yeah, they're probably the best team in the world right now.
What was the first World Cup that you remember watching?
First World Cup. I think I definitely saw some of the 98 World Cup, but I mean, I was also 5 years old. So there's like, or yeah, 6 years old. So it's hard to say how much of that I remember. I remember cheering, I guess, for France because they did win the cup. And I guess internationally, I've cheered for France ever since. 2002, I remember a lot more clearly because that was held in Asia. I think it was split between Korea and Japan, I believe. And yeah, I just remember that World Cup just because like it was a lot of surprising results. I think now that I've grown into adulthood and look back at it, and I was like, okay, some of these results were probably tainted in some ways. I know that's always the popular narrative, but I think the Final Four was like Turkey was in it, like South Korea might have made it to the top four. Brazil was in it, and I think Germany was that the Final Four? Yeah. So you just don't expect, like, for example, Turkey and South Korea, as much as they do have some good footballers, like, to be one of the four finalists of the World Cup is still quite a surprise.
And even Senegal too in that World Cup, and one of the first games beat France, and that still to this day is ranked as one of the biggest upsets in World Cup history. And so the reason why I asked that is because I remember when I first fell in love with sports, it was because of the same thing, soccer, in the 2006 World Cup. And I know that people may look at you and say, oh, you love basketball, you love basketball, you love basketball, but it's like something brought you there. And that love for soccer is what it goes hand in hand with loving basketball. So whenever you're tweeting about Liverpool or slandering Chelsea or Man U and preying on their downfall, whatever it may be, like, that's what makes the coverage, I think, that much more fun, because you can spread across multiple fandoms and you're not just, oh, stick to basketball. Like, you can laugh at Man U losing 5-1, and you can, brag about winning the Carabao Cup or winning the FA Cup, or what Diogo Jota is going to do this week for Liverpool, or if they're going to win the title and come back against City, all those sorts of fun little quips.
Yeah, I think honestly, like, the fact that like the Raptors are my job and the Raptors are my life, like, I just spend so much time on it, and I still enjoy it as much, if not even more than I did before when I was just strictly a fan. But it's kind of nice to have something else to sort of have a pure like fan experience. Like, I don't expect to cover Liverpool in any capacity. I just like to watch them play and just just strictly be a fan rather than being a fan slash journalist slash podcaster slash whatever.
Would you say the top 3 Liverpool players you've seen in your lifetime as a fan of them?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously Gerrard has to make the list. Salah has to make the list, and Mane. Yeah, it's a pretty solid top 3, quite honestly. But there's the funny thing is, like, they haven't had like the super world class players. Like, I feel like I'm leaving out Luis Suarez. I think it's just like the tenure is a little bit short. Plus, I think he needs to be humbled a little bit after biting people so often. But he is undeniably, like, he had one of the greatest seasons ever in the Premier League. But yeah, I'm gonna go with those 3.
Will you take Rafa Benitez as the best coach then too, on top of that?
No, Jurgen is on a different level. Jurgen Klopp is a guy that, like, I don't know. I think sometimes you just get hypnotized by certain figures in sports and you really buy into them as the like, I think there's a bigger cult of personality in soccer than there is in basketball. You kind of rarely see it in basketball. I guess like guys like Phil Jackson kind of inspire a little bit of that, but like
Mhm.
in soccer, like you truly believe in the man, right? Like you look at Jose Mourinho and like the amount of like coverage and hype, and there are people who stand coaches, like they'll literally, the way that people stand LeBron and will go from being a Cavs fan to a Heat fan to a Cavs fan to a Laker fan, people will go and be a Jose fan and, and move from like United to Roma or Porto or Inter or Chelsea or Real Madrid or wherever, right? And that's kind of incredible. So in any case, yeah, Jurgen is on a different level. There's nothing like him. I think he's such a true, genuine personality that you can watch him for 5 minutes and you can totally understand why people are drawn to him and why he's a great manager.
Is he a top three coach in the world?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Where
I mean
where do you
Pep is also in there as well.
where do you rank Jurgen Klopp then in the top three?
I mean, I'm biased. I'm gonna say he's top one right now. I really like the job that he's done. I think he has a style of play, which I think obviously every great manager, any coach in any situation needs to have, right? He brings in players that fits the style. When players come to Liverpool, they improve as players. It's very few players that you look at where they haven't probably performed, and usually it's due to injuries. When that happens, that system really allows them to really lift the players. And honestly, when you think about it, like Liverpool, yes, of course they're a top club. They have lots of money, but they don't. They're not spending their way to the top the same way that a City would, or even the way that United would. Um, and the fact that they're able to take all these signings and make the most of them to build a team that is contention to be what this is like their third um European finals appearance in 5 years. Like that's pretty incredible, just based on even the budget that they've had. So I'm gonna take him as top one. I know he personally would have Pep Guardiola ahead of him, and there's something about that bald head that makes people think he's extremely smart. But listen, I would like to see him lift win win the Champions League with City first before I think we fully crown him there.
Who would you say is the other coach that fits in with that trio then?
I think it's so hard because players coaches come in and out. I have a lot of respect for Jose and the things that he's been able to do. I know the last couple of places he's been, I guess I forgot Tottenham in that list. That's really weird that he was coaching at Tottenham. Uh, but you have to respect him for what he's done in his career. I mean, to win Europe with managing Porto is incredible. What he did with Inter was incredible. Winning the treble there. What he did in Real Madrid to disrupt Barcelona's like stronghold over La Liga and also even just over Europe in general is incredible. And you got to give a lot of love to Carlo as well, Carlo Ancelotti, who has been a manager for so long. I just like when I think about this isn't even anything about football necessarily. It's just like when you think about someone who you would like to be your boss, I would very much like Carlo to be my boss, a guy who gives you a lot of confidence, gives you a lot of freedom, doesn't sort of like impose his will in any sort of way. Um, and at the end of the day, if you do a good job, he'll smoke a cigar with you. Like that sounds like a pretty good boss to me. So I salute Don Carlo as well.
I was watching United Norwich at a pub downtown, I
Mhm.
think about a month ago or so, and we're having this discussion with the bartender about who's the greatest manager of all time, and the person there said, "Oh, Sir Alex Ferguson is the best." But
Yeah, fair.
I would like to know your opinion if you think Sir Alex is the best, or if not, then who you would say is the best of all time outside of like, or because we talk about this generation, but like, does Sir Alex eclipse everyone who you just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, and admittedly, that's the era of the Premier League where I wasn't watching as much, so I don't fully know. I mean, I caught more of the tail end of it. I think he has a great case for it, just based on the program that he built there. It feels like, especially in the Premier League, there is just like, I mean, it was them, it was Arsenal, it was Chelsea, I guess to some degree, but he has a good case for it. But honestly, I think Pep and Jose have a really good case as well, like what they've done in different leagues. And yeah, I don't know. That's also really impressive to me. I guess that's the only knock against Sir Alex, right? Like he's really, I mean, I guess there was he managed in the Scottish League and all that stuff, but like realistically, he's celebrated because of what he's done in one league. I think the fact that those other guys have won it at all levels with other leagues is also very impressive to me. It's hard to say though, and I'm not the most informed in this sense because I didn't watch them.
That's fair. I know that people. Well, I mean, growing up as a kid, Jose Mourinho was coaching with Chelsea. I remember him there. I remember him. I don't really remember him with Porto. I was a bit too young, but people have always loved slandering him from what I've seen as I grew older. But now that I'm, I guess, in my mid 20s, like I don't see as much slander towards him because I think that people start to respect his reputation a little bit more. And of course,
Yeah.
aside from the famous "I am Jose Mourinho" like sound that's blowing up on TikTok right now, I do think that he's probably one of the more underrated coaches. Not to say that he's like grossly underrated, but
Yeah.
maybe doesn't get as much of the attention, or didn't get as much of the attention probably before as he is getting now, and that he has deserved his entire career. Because even when you look at what he did with Porto to beat Man U to get to the Champions League final 2004 is probably one of the most impressive feats in the history of the competition.
I agree. Yeah. I think the situation there is, look, one, he plays a style of football that a lot of people would describe as negative. I think that I mean, he's far from the first manager to do so, but the managers who really get lots of love and lots of praise are always the ones that play brilliant attacking football. Of course, Mourinho himself would say, well, Real Madrid, the most goals ever they scored in the league was with him. So how is that negative football? Whatever. But there's that element. And I just think there's an element where he kind of embraces that villainous, where people like to find someone to cast as the villain. It's more interesting on a storytelling perspective, and I think for him, like, he's always embraced that, especially at Real Madrid. I think the whole idea was to sort of usurp Barcelona, and he was able to do that at certain times. I think when you look at what he did at Chelsea, and also just sort of like the the famous clip, the famous quote of him saying, I think I'm a special one, like that's, and before he did anything. But then of course he then went on and proved that he absolutely was a special one, right? But people don't necessarily like the arrogance kind of thing. But to me, I really enjoy it. I think he's a really entertaining person. And also when you watch some of the stuff involving, like, let's say, the documentary where they covered his time in Tottenham, and you get to see, like, in more detail, like how he is and what kind of person he is around his players. It's also very easy to see why so many players love him. And he's managed some of the best players in the world, and he is, like, universally respected on that front from his own players. So you have to really rate him. I mean, there's no real reason why he's not, like, at minimum top 5 all time. I mean, he's done tremendous things.
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask, like, where would you rank him then amongst Premier League coaches, or at least just coaches in general? And I mean, in the top 5, that's pretty bold, but at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you, because when you think about all the other names that we've named, Klopp is great, Ancelotti, Sir Alex Ferguson, Pep, like Mourinho is pretty close. If he's not in the top 5, he's pretty close. And so I think,
actively it's so hard to say, because there hasn't been, like, a super successful project for him in the last few stops that he's had. But I mean, like, and it's also hard to compare him to, say, someone like I guess even like an Antonio Conte, who kind of like plays relatively similarly. I guess he's had more recent success, but I don't know. If I had Mourinho as my manager, I mean, obviously I wouldn't have him over Klopp, but, like, if I had him at a different club or whatever, I wouldn't be upset at it. Like, he's a winning manager. Like, and I think, again, the players really adore him. Now, I think some of the tactics that he'll use will be a little bit harder to watch. I think I'd rather watch attacking football, but if you give me the choice between winning and winning ugly versus, like, losing pretty, I think I would always win ugly. So
100%. I wanted to ask, in your time covering the Raptors and being involved with NBA coverage, you have had the chance to interview some Raptors players. Who would you say have been the top 3 guys that have been your favorites to interview?
My favorite player on the Raptors that I've interviewed, it's got to be Fred. I think Fred is just, like, so thoughtful in his answers. He has this quality about him where I think for a lot of players, whether that's because of the media training they receive, or whether they're just in a position where, look, I mean, a lot of times when you're asking players to do media, they have not that much incentive to do media or to give you a good quote, like, or to share himself or herself with you. Like the benefit is definitely in favor of the journalist. We'll say that much. So for whatever reason, players tend to be quite dry or quite guarded, especially if they don't know you. I think the thing with Fred, and I've interviewed him a few times, is just like he's always been very open and honest about everything. And I think you have to be really comfortable and really self-assured to be honest in that public setting. But he does so, and that's something I really respect about him, because it makes it a lot more interesting to follow his career. You get his perspective on a lot of things, and honestly, he just seems to me like a truly caring and genuine person who, wants to obviously succeed as an athlete, but also has the wherewithal to be conscious and to be a complete human being. So I really enjoy Fred. I would say the other top two. Honestly, I didn't get to interview DeMar that much, but I really did enjoy interviewing DeMar. He was probably one of my first ever interviews that I conducted, and it was in a bit of an awkward scenario at the back of some sort of weird Foot Locker commercial shoot. But he was super open as well, kind of the same qualities expected about Fred. He also gives a really great quote, which I think all media members appreciate. And then the third favorite person to interview, I mean, I don't know. I haven't interviewed players like repeatedly that often. I mean, I've interviewed Fred 3 times, which I think really helps in a one-on-one setting. But the other players I haven't repeatedly interviewed all that much. I mean, the other guy I have repeatedly interviewed a ton is Yuta Watanabe. So I guess I'm gonna go with Yuta as my third, mostly because when I interview Yuta, it's a very different interview than most other athletes, where I mostly ask him questions like, "Hey, who is your favorite player to play with on Super Smash Bros?" And he'll tell me it's Fox.
What other kinds of questions and how the conversation's been like with Yuta?
Yeah, I mean, with Yuta, it's real interesting because I think for me, I'm always curious from my perspective as, as an Asian person. And so there's not a lot of Asian athletes in the NBA. So to hear his experiences and sort of like the things that he's gone through is always something that is a story that I want to tell. I think it's also a story that for a lot of people in the Toronto market, they want to hear, because of something like, when Yuta first came to Canada, he didn't speak English. And I think a lot of other people can kind of have that same experience, quite honestly. Like it reminds me a little bit of my parents when they first came here, although they did speak English, but they just really were not good at it, and they're not confident in speaking it publicly. I think I wanted to ask him about those experiences. I wanted to ask him about sort of like being between two cultures and the experiences there. So that's a little different than the kind of questions I would ask other athletes. I mean, I guess I could with other players as well. It's like the Raptors have, lots of international players. They've always had that, but I don't know. There's obviously there's an overlap with the fact that 2 of us are Asian, and a lot of our conversations have skewed in that way. And it's good because I think it's good for him too, because when he does media here, I think he's not only is he speaking in his second language, but he's speaking towards a culture that is more foreign to him, so he's more closed. And then the other type of interview, he's obviously speaking in Japanese to Japanese reporters, which I would really like to know what he says. But yeah, I mean, that's a different sort of side of him. So to have someone here who is Asian, is speaking to him in English, it's kind of a mix of the two sort of worlds that he lives in. And hopefully he's enjoyed it, because I've really enjoyed speaking with Yuta. I know I make it a joke a lot, but he's a guy who I really was rooting for as a fan. And it's a shame that he didn't get to play too much with the Raptors, and I doubt he'll be back on the team next year. But he gave us 2 good years, or he gave me 2 good years at least.
Minus the getting crowned by Anthony Edwards, I think that
yeah,
he relatively had a successful run here with Toronto.
It's all good. I mean, Anthony Edwards stepped out of bounds before that. That shouldn't even count as 2 points.
Literally. I do want to ask though a little bit more on that, about people. The discussion of representation mattering continues to live on in the media, in many different facets of pop culture and our life in general. And as you mentioned, that you both share Asian heritage. So what does your representation of your culture and your heritage mean in the landscape of the media?
I mean, I think that's 2 things. What does it mean to me? It means I'm being myself. Like the difficulty with trying to represent, more actively represent, is like I can only represent for myself. I mean, my experiences as someone who, you know, was born in China is very different than someone whose experiences of being born in Japan. My experiences of even just being born in northern China is very different than being born in lots of different parts in China. Like, my immigrant experience is unique in that sense as well. And so you can only really represent yourself because you have not lived in any other life. You can be sympathetic and read up on other people's perspectives, but you're not representing, you're relaying in that sense. So for myself, I'm just being myself. And obviously a big part of myself is my heritage. I think what the significance and I guess representation, what that means for other people is sort of like what other people see when they see me, what they receive, and sort of how they engage with that, whether that's sharing some of those experiences, whether that's sort of seeing the commonalities, or even just straight up recognizing that I'm different in a certain way. And in that sense, that's for other people to sort of take away. It's hard for me to specifically speak to what I represent to other people, but I do understand that there is a responsibility there, because a lot of people do take a lot from me as a public person. And so my responsibility there is to relay things in a manner where I feel like issues that are important to the community, that are important to myself, I would like to pass those on and at least spread awareness and generate positive action towards things, especially right now. Like, for example, like, with COVID-19, since the start of COVID-19, stats are like, incidents of hate crimes towards, Asians in Canada, for example, is like up 300%. It's similar in the United States, similar to a lot of other places where, like the Australia or the UK, where a lot of, Asians, especially East Asians, emigrate to. And when you hear about these incidences and how dark and how grim some of these stories are, it does make you feel really isolated, especially considering that it's not necessarily as much of a major topic towards the greater global sense. But it's really, really scary to think about. It's really honestly just infuriating to think about. And for me, it was like, you got to find a way to positively channel that, because even though these things are truly awful, like you have to still be able to live within the society. Like, it's a part of being in any sort of society is that there's an element of violence and senselessness, and you have to be able to still move on with your day. And for me, it was just understanding sort of like why some of these things are happening. I know some of these things feel senseless, but they still have certain motivations that sort of bring them about. And being able to understand some of those things at least helped me contextualize and essentially just live my life in a way that was less miserable. And if I could sort of help other people, especially other Asians, understand why that is, I think that is an act of public good. So, when you think about representation, it can mean so many different things. But right now, at least for me right now in this current moment, that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
What are three major things that are a part of your culture, heritage, could be tied with your family, that are the most important parts of what makes you who you are and that you hold on to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, three things. I mean, I think number one, it's like the sense of community. I think, people always talk about in a larger sense that, like, a lot of Asian societies are collectivist societies, which is to mean that it's about the greater good of the world and the greater good of your community. And I always think in that sense too of like, if I come up right in the sports media industry, like, who else can I bring with me, and who are the people that I want to recommend and lend opportunities to. And I'm not really in a direct position of hiring. I've never been even in a position where I've interviewed anyone for a job, but I've based on my standing, I've been able to sort of help influence or at least introduce people into a new spot. And that's always what my goal is, to try to do so in a way that I feel is fair, or do so in a way that I think is going to benefit whatever employer that's bringing people in. And also just like what's going to help bring about equity in the industry, because I think to me, like, that's something that when you've worked in it long enough, like, I've been in newsrooms where like 90% of people in there are white men, and that just feels very unrepresentative of just, especially being in Toronto in particular, where at least 50% of the people are recent immigrants and at least 50% of the people are visible minorities. I also think that, other things in culture, I think, being sort of family oriented and sort of, really not just respecting sort of the family order, but also being able to, um, you know, uh, help the family as much as possible. Like I think this is probably a more universal experience. I'm really not familiar with any culture that doesn't value family. But I think at the same time, like this is something that is like a core principle of like how Chinese societies function. There's this, it's like one of the core tenets of Confucianism, for example. And then I think the third thing for me, just speaking to my own family's experience, is just sort of like being kind and being good to the world. I mean, my mom is a very big activist in the environmental space. My dad is much more of a shy person and doesn't publicly advocate for many things. He's not a very public person at all, but the way he's treated people and having been around him my entire life, like, trying to make the world a better place is something that truly matters to me. And I'm very humbled to understand that I can affect very little of that, but in what I have, I try to make the most of. And yeah, those are the three things.
Well, I'm so appreciative of your openness and honesty and just being able to be transparent, because I think that that's such an important thing when it comes to understanding what makes us who we are and the importance of our culture and heritage. And I think that's what, again, I'm originally from Winnipeg,
Mhm.
and living in Toronto, it's like a mirror. Being a very multicultural city brings out a lot of different great things, and it makes for a more educational experience too, I think, rather than if
Mhm.
you live in a place where you don't get to meet people who don't look like yourself or are from different places or speak differently or know different things. I think that's a really important part of it. And I see that you do embrace that and do a lot of good work in terms of bringing awareness to that as well, even if you're not like doing it all the time, like very consciously.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, shout out to Winnipeg, by the way. I keep finding out new facts about Winnipeg, including the fact that there's apparently a very substantial Filipino population in Winnippeg.
I knew you were
I,
going to
I
say that.
I heard there's a Jollibee's in Winnipeg. My barber told me this the other day. He's Filipino, obviously. Um, Not obviously, but there are a lot of Filipino barbers, and I'm going to keep it real. In any case, yeah, he was telling me that there's a Jollibee's in Winnipeg, which brought me a lot of delight. The idea of that. But that's the cool thing, right, about being in Canada, is that, like, because obviously Canada has had a declining population for a long time. They really needed to increase their workforce, so that's why they've been able to sort of open immigration so much towards the rest of the world. And I think obviously there are downsides to that. It's not just like it's not just a situation where it's a win for everybody. I think you're starting to see some of the hatred that comes from some of these rhetorics, and you see a lot of politicians weaponize the topic of immigration. But to me, it's something that's been always very beautiful. It's something that I've always appreciated. If my parents never left China, I probably would only know Chinese people. Like, I'm not kidding. There's no one else in China other than Chinese people. Like, there's very few foreigners, or very few even minorities within China. But yeah, to have lived this life and to have friends from all over the world, I feel more enriched in that sense. And yeah, like now I live in a Portuguese neighborhood. Yeah, so I got to introduce to all sorts of Portuguese things, including Pena candies.
Oh, really? There you go.
I have a bag of them on my desk. It's yeah, anyway. It's
If
a
you
great
haven't,
soft candy if you want to. It's honestly probably the most cost effective soft candy there is. You can get a whole bag for like $2.
I think that Portuguese food at grocery stores in Toronto, especially at the major
Yeah.
ones, are some of the most cost-effective items you can buy, and I've been loving it here. Even though it's really weird. So when you think about the cultural communities that exist in Winnipeg compared to Toronto, very,
Uh,
very similar. But Winnipeg, yes, they do have the second biggest Filipino community of any city in Canada, but they would also be up there in terms of Portuguese people, although there is only one Portuguese restaurant in all of Winnipeg,
wow.
and it's only within side one of the only Portuguese like grocery stores left in the entire city. They
Wow.
came with my grandparents' generation, and as soon as they got older, they all just close their businesses down, and that's it. So I've been able to have the blessing here in Toronto of being able to see shorties or sardinias or whatever at just no frills or food basics. Whereas in Winnipeg, you have to go to the specialty store just to see that, and you have to, like, all the grandmas and grandpas know the people in the community. But I did want to touch on one thing in particular. You talked about, saying there's Jollibee in Winnipeg. They do have also a lot of like local Filipino restaurants, like just unique to the city. And I remember when the first Jollibee opened up, like it was a lineup around the block for like 2 weeks straight. And it was I haven't been yet myself, so maybe this is a sign that I need to get to a Jollibee right now. But yeah, sure. It's buzzing in Winnipeg, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, you could put ketchup on your spaghetti at home too,
or hot dogs, whatever you like. But I mean,
I can't explain Filipino food. I mean, I know it's delicious, but as a Chinese person, it doesn't even make a lot of sense to me sometimes. But hey, listen, it's it is delicious. So however you come about it, it's great. Now, it's funny you say that, because I think, for a lot of people's experiences, a lot of, immigrants, like they come here, the number one thing that people are able to do is to bring their food over, right? That's one of the easiest way to share your culture with people. And the unfortunate thing is just like it's very hard to stay in the restaurant business, right? So once people struggle for all their lives, oh wow, what a goal from Liverpool! Wow, incredible goal, Joel Matip, incredibly important off a corner. But when you start the restaurants, like it's a real grind. And I think for almost all immigrants, the idea is to sort of make your kids have a much easier life. You take all the hard hits so that your kids can, have an even footing in society and eventually try to build wealth and build their families in a way that isn't as hard. So it is kind of sad to hear that there is only one restaurant, because honestly, even on my bus route to work, I probably literally, I'm not kidding, I passed by like 5 churrasqueras. So yeah.
Even within like Bloor Street West, the first time I was walking down there, I was like, there's so many of those, just like no name on the outside, just you go in and the owner and this, that, and the other. And it's so like, I walked in there and I told 2 of my friends in school are from Brazil. And so I was telling them, if you walked in here and you put a cover on the windows, you wouldn't be able to tell if you're in Winnipeg or in Toronto. Like it is a very authentic experience. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. We're very lucky, honestly. This is one of the coolest places in the world to live in.
100%. I mean, I wish sometimes that it wasn't so expensive, especially in places like Toronto or Vancouver that are so beautiful. But I mean, love where you live, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, that's a whole different issue altogether. I don't really believe in the idea that people should speculate on the value of housing unless you actually live in it. Like it's really grimy investment vehicle to think about. But that's a whole different topic. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, 100%. I mean, it's, that's a podcast for another day, talking about
very much
the problems that exist in Toronto. But at the end of the day, we do a lot of great things. We're very fortunate with where we live. And I'm glad that we get to share these experiences with people from all over the world. Whereas in a lot of places, like you said, in China, like I have friends who are from India, and they're like, dude, like at 3 a.m, you see like 200 people in the street, and like you would never see someone that doesn't look like you. It's just like, it's so much huger than we can ever conceptualize, which to me is also so fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, even think about it right now, like to get meta about it, like you're Portuguese/Brazilian and I'm Chinese, and we're living in Canada. We're talking about Winnipeg. We're talking about Jollibee. We're talking about the Toronto Raptors. Like it's a real mix, but that's, again, like that's what makes, life here, for me at least, especially enriching.
So Will, we're getting towards the end of our time on today's episode. So I want to do a few more questions to have a little bit more fun before we go and do a fun segments to end.
Let's do it.
I want to do, and I'm not trying to rip off Gary Vee, but an overrated, underrated segment. I haven't done this before, so I want to see how we do here. Okay. Mike Budenholzer.
Yeah, I would say overrated. I think the reason he's overrated is because you want a coach to help you win in the playoffs, and you have to be very, very creative and flexible as a coach. And he has just not shown. He's been to the playoffs many times because he's able to set up a team for success with the regular season, and it works really well. But when it comes down to the playoffs and adjustments, you can't say he hasn't had great players. He's had tons of great players. But the amount of like great adjustments that you have seen from Mike Budenholzer is just not enough. I mean, like he did win the championship I guess as recently as last year, which really helps. But I think his reputation is kind of still the same. He's a guy who kind of plays one way, and I appreciate coaches that can be flexible. So I'm gonna say overrated.
Quinn Snyder.
Uh, is he even rated? Who likes Quinn Snyder? I mean, you know what? I'm gonna say underrated because he wears I don't know if you've seen a Quinn Snyder interview, which I don't know why people would follow that closely, but if you go looking for a Quinn Snyder interview, a lot of his interviews, he's wearing like a vest that like I mean, like honestly, man, the only other people I've seen wear that kind of vest are like, roadmen in the UK. So salute to him. He's probably auditioning for a spot on Top Boy 3.
Taylor Jenkins.
Um, I would say underrated still. I think he's done a great job. I think it's honestly it's pretty incredible to me that he's only 38 years old. He does look substantially older than that, which I think is just owing to the coaching profession. You really have to put in like grueling hours, and it ages you tremendously. But yeah, I think he's done a really good job with Memphis. I don't think he like covered himself in glory at all this year with how much he kind of publicly complained about injuries, and he demonized Jordan Poole for a very innocuous basketball play. I thought that was just I don't know, that was a little shameless. I can't even lie, but no, he's a really good coach, and he's done a really good job with that Memphis team. And yeah, I would still say he's underrated because I honestly think you could poll like 100 NBA fans, and how I wouldn't say more than 40 even know who Taylor Jenkins is.
Now going for some former coaches, Brad Stevens.
I think Brad Stevens is like properly rated. I mean, like he's overrated in the Celtics market because there were obviously those infamous tweets where it was like, would you rather start our franchise with Giannis or Brad Stevens? Like, are you kidding me? I think Brad Stevens would, now that he's an executive, would rather pick Giannis to start his franchise with. But no, he's a really, really good coach. Tactically, he did a really good job setting up that team. He gave that team an identity. I think Boston, it was really impressive to me that they were always a really good defensive team, even though they didn't have like dominant defensive players. That is to me one of the signs of a coach, is when you can sort of make up for the gaps that are in your roster by playing a certain system. So yeah, I will go. He's underrated to me still. I know that he's no longer coaching and he's in a different role, but that guy was a really good coach, man. Very smart man.
Now going on to some Raptors, Andrea
Yeah,
Bargnani.
yeah, overrated, man. There is no way to like underrate Bargnani. He was not a good player. I don't think there was like I don't know. Okay, well, you could say things like, okay, so defensively, obviously, that was not his strong suit at all. Even with the 3-point shooting, he was never like a prolific 3-point shooter. He had size, but never really played with the size in any sort of meaningful way. He's like if you drafted Mike Muscala first overall. So yeah, overrated. I really dislike Bargnani, man. And also the advanced stats. He was one of the guys where when advanced stats are starting to come out, all the advanced stats said this guy sucked, and the Raptors just kept signing him to new deals. So now I'm good.
Jose Calderon.
I mean, he's a little overrated in the Raptor fan base. I think at that time there were not a lot of good Raptors players, so Jose's ability to, I would say, not even lift the floor because they were still losing, but just to be like a good player when everyone else was quite bad, made him look a little bit better. But I mean, he was also like a really good facilitator of the basketball, shot the ball very efficiently. I would argue probably could have shot it even more, but I enjoyed the two-man game that he played with Chris Bosh. Him pick and popping of Chris Bosh was always good for like 6 points every quarter. So yeah, I really did like Jose, and he was also quite a nice person to deal with. But yeah, I'd still say he's a little overrated from the Raptor fans.
And now, in terms of which player you'd rather take, 3 questions before we wrap. First, who would you rather have on your team, Chris Paul or Russell Westbrook?
Chris Paul. That's not that much of a distinction to me. I think like, you know, it depends on how much talent you have around Chris Paul. I think he's definitely a guy who can win a championship, but he probably is like has to be your third best player at most.
James Harden or LeBron?
That's not even close, LeBron. Come on. That's not even a conversation. Yeah.
Okay, who would you rather have? Kyle Lowry as your starting point guard, or would you rather have Fred VanVleet as your starting point guard, but with more talent around?
Um, yeah, that's hard. I If there's a lot of talent around them, I would probably still take Kyle just because of the fact that Kyle has some certain physical advantages over Fred. He's more athletic. If we're talking about prime Kyle too, like he definitely was way more athletic than Fred is. Fred is a much better shooter, but also Kyle is a very good shooter. The difference to me is like Kyle, his playmaking eventually got to a point where he was such an elite playmaker. And that's what's helped extend his career. That's what helped the Raptors win the championship. Obviously, Fred helped as well, but I still think I'm slightly leaning towards Kyle. Although Fred's really closing the gap, and that's very impressive to me.
A final question. What was the thing that you remember most from the very end of Game 6 in the 2019 NBA Finals?
Honestly, I remember almost everything. Like I remember so many key details. Not even just on the court, but being in the building. I remember at one point joking to Chris Haynes at Yahoo, because we were sitting quite closely, that he turned over to me. He's like, "Hey man, who would you vote for Finals MVP?" Because there's only like 7 people who vote, and I was like, "You should vote for Fred, man." And he's like, "Nah, nah, nah. I mean, you know, he's good, but like, come on, I'm probably gonna go Kawhi." I'm like, "All right, but you should vote for Fred." Ultimately, someone did vote for Fred. It wasn't Chris Haynes. I tried. I remember during that like 0.9 seconds, which took a very long time. There's a review, all this other stuff. I remember grabbing Blake Murphy in the arm like very excitedly, and that was super cool because Blake has been with me in this journey as a Raptors reporter all the way. For people who don't know, he gave me my start at Raptors Republic. He helped me get my first paid job at The Score. He's helped me collaborate over and over and over again. Even today, like we have him on every single week. And yeah, to the fact that the two of us who started out as like fan bloggers were at the NBA Finals and the Raptors were really like on the verge of clinching that thing was so cool. And for a moment, I just kind of like got out of the professionalism of it all and was just kind of like, oh my God, we're gonna win a championship. And Blake kind of calmed me down a little bit. I was like, yo, relax, like we're still in this position. But then he's also shot me a little quick smile too. And I just always remember like how sweet it was that we were able to sort of get to that point in our careers. And then of course I remember like going into the locker room and like, man, that thing was ridiculous. There was just like a river of champagne and beer on the ground, and everybody was celebrating, and we were getting sprayed by champagne from all sorts of players. And I was right in front of Norman Powell when he decided to empty a whole bottle of champagne on his head. I remember even some of the quiet moments of like sitting in the corner with Wayne Embry. And obviously, for people who don't know Wayne, you should definitely look up his story. Such a historic and historically important figure for the NBA. And getting to sit alone with Wayne, because Wayne was like probably 85, 86 years old, so he's not jumping up and down or anything and popping bottles, but getting to sit down with him and sort of, just even hearing some of the conversations with him was super cool. So, but I honestly have a lifetime of memories, honestly, from just that one game alone and that whole championship run.
Well, I want to thank you so much for having been on today's episode. It's been a long time coming that I've been following your work and seeing all the great things you've been doing. And I'm finally glad that we were able to sit down and chat and have a lot of fun today, because you are definitely one of the premier people that covers the Raptors right now as the landscape goes in Canadian basketball. And so I appreciate you offering your insights, your humor, and sharing a little bit about your story and about what has led you to this point.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for having me. Honestly, I didn't expect this interview to kind of go in this direction. There's a lot of Winnipeg talk and stuff like that, but it was very cool, honestly. And I appreciate you giving me this platform to discuss these things aside from basketball. And yeah, good luck with the show.
And thank you to the listener for enjoying today's episode with host of the Raptors show for Sportsnet, Will Liu.